Wasn't it me who wrote it? And I say that this man has broken the law.
George Miller's Mad Max franchise has given us many iconic characters over the years, but nothing comes really close to the eccentricity of his villains. Plus, fans of Mad Max were super pissed to find out that Furiosa might indeed go on to become a dictatorial despot like Immortan Joe. However, I don't understand why people are getting so salty about it, because Miller had already explored this theme in Mad Max 3 Beyond Thunderdome. The Mad Max series, which started in 1979 with the raw and intense revenge story Mad Max, has evolved significantly. Under Miller's direction, the franchise took a more dramatic turn into the entire unhinged post-apocalyptic sci-fi zone. And with that being said, Aunty Entity, the main villain from Mad Max 3 Beyond Thunderdome, is the only female villain in the entire franchise, while also being the only one who goes on to live a life in the Wasteland after a power-packed clash with Max. This is probably why Beyond Thunderdome received a more muted response from the audience as compared to its predecessors. But if you try and think about it, you will notice that Furiosa sort of reinforced the exact same themes that this underrated Mad Max film tried to explore. Not just that, Furiosa also gave us a few hints to draw plausible theories about how Aunty Entity's rule might have ended in a defeat after the events of Beyond Thunderdome. The recent prequel sort of bridged the space between Miller's franchise reboot and the OG trilogy by exploring the dystopian world in the past 15 years before it led up to the events of Fury Road. Furiosa could not just expand on many ideas, but also explore particular lores that were already established in the franchise before. Of course, nobody expected to see any connection between the two films, but if you keep the timeline in mind, the events of Furiosa come after Max meets Aunty Entity. Even though Max's cameo in Furiosa leads up to the events of Fury Road itself, we did get some juicy tidbits to feed our delusional theories on what might have happened to Aunty Entity's regime after Mad Max 3. So without wasting another moment, let's get right to it. Before we go into explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you, and let's begin. Aunty Entity's influence in Mad Max 3 Beyond Thunderdome. Now, Aunty Entity was not exactly your typical villain. When George Miller created her character, he began with the idea that she should be able to reflect an aura that represented how today's tyrant was yesterday's hero. That is exactly why the film makes you think that Aunty Entity had initially started Bartertown with good intentions, aiming to rebuild civilization, restore trade, and give people a glimmer of hope for the future. Sadly, as Miller explains, she ended up becoming a tyrant in the process. Aunty Entity held a lot of power in Bartertown through her cunning and politically savvy tactics. She was also the one who pushed for many of the town's laws, which she claimed to have personally written. Over time, Aunty had introduced various rituals that eventually became part of the town's way of life. But what the townies did not understand was that it was all designed to keep her in charge. The harshness of the world had forced Aunty Entity to become a master manipulator, much like the leaders from before the world fell apart, proving that history often repeats itself. But despite all she had helped to build, and of course her political scheming, Aunty Entity's lack of scientific understanding of how the underworld operated led to her eventual downfall. Much like Tina Turner, the woman who brought Aunty Entity to life, she harbored a love for music and a creative spirit. She even kept her own musician, Tauntaun Tattoo, within her quarters to play the saxophone for her. So Aunty Entity said that before the Pox eclipse, she was a nobody. But the day after the world fell, she had the chance to become somebody, because unlike many, she survived. This idea captures the essence of the Mad Max universe as a whole, because all these wild characters who were once ordinary citizens literally reinvented themselves to survive the hellish world they now faced. You could even argue that unhinged tyrants like Humongous, Dementus, Immortan Joe, and Aunty Entity were somehow always like this, so the apocalyptic circumstances only allowed them the opportunity to embrace themselves. Anyways, after the fall of civilization, Aunty Entity became powerful enough to establish Bartertown as a permanent trading settlement. She fortified it and imposed a harsh form of law and order on its residents and traders. as she told Max Aunty Entity stopped at nothing to defend the semblance of civilization that she had managed to create while the world was dying. To this end, the cunning Aunty even manipulated Mad Max into a gladiatorial battle known as the Thunderdome against the champion Blaster, with the hopes that Max would kill Blaster. Basically, she was using Max as the convenient means to carry out a political assassination without disrupting the fragile illusion of lawful order that kept Bartertown from descending into absolute chaos. Two birds and one stone, huh? But after Max defeated Blaster in combat, he refused to kill the guy after discovering that Blaster had Down syndrome. Of course, Aunty Entity was furious to not get her will and had Blaster executed to uphold the rule which stated that only one man could leave the Thunderdome alive. She then invoked the harsh ritual of Bust a Deal Face the Wheel on Max. So when Max spinned the wheel, it landed on Gulag. And just like that, he was exiled to the harsh desert, where his chances of survival were looking pretty slim. Luckily, Max was rescued from a near-death state by a group of children who were living in a hidden oasis valley beyond the wilderness of the desert. As he recovered, Max learned about their Peter Pan-esque cult-like belief in Tomorrowland, which is apparently a mythical paradise based on their fragmented memories of civilization. I don't know why when I heard the concept of Tomorrowland for the first time, the first thought that came to my mind was how these kids were probably reimagining Disneyland or something to be their idea of paradise. Anyways, jokes apart, Max explained to these kids that such a place once existed but was now destroyed by the apocalypse. He warned them that if ever they left their secluded paradise, the first thing they would encounter is the treacherous hold of Bartertown, assuming that the desert does not already claim them before. Despite his warning, a small group of children decide to leave anyway, and of course Max was a self-righteous cop at one point of his life, so his savior complex allowed him no choice but to follow them. Max catches up to these kids just when a large sinkhole in the sand dunes was about to swallow them, and even if he managed to pull some of them out, Max lost at least one child. From there on, they had no choice but to continue the journey, and once they reached near Bartertown, they began looking for Master, only to find out that Aunty Entity had reduced him to a mere slave. Of course, Max and the children somehow managed to free him, but in this process, the guards were alerted, ultimately leading to a frantic chase. Aunty Entity then sent in her elite drivers to pursue Max and the children, who were escaping with Master in a modified truck on the train tracks. But in the chaos, Bartertown's methane factory got damaged and exploded. Eventually, Max and his group managed to ride the rail line until it ended near the hideout of the pilot who attacked Max earlier. When Max convinced the pilot to help them escape in his airplane, he realized that there was not enough runway for a takeoff with all the weight. So with the attackers closing in, Max took a truck and smashed through a roadblock, finally allowing the children to escape. At the end, we see Aunty Entity directly confronting Max, but then something changes in her. She seems to realize the despicable tyrant this harsh world had turned her into and somehow empathizes with Max. Despite being surrounded by her guards, Max earns her respect and she lets him live after acknowledging their strange connection. As for Aunty Entity's civilization and her former position of power, it was left unknown at the end of the story, but I do have a feeling that she then went on to rebuild Bartertown with just intentions. I honestly believe that Aunty Entity really stood out a bit for her diva-like appearance in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, but one thing is for sure, no matter what face she put up, Aunty Entity really wanted to restore humanity. Sadly, the only issue was that she continued to act based on what she thought was right and regularly kept executing people who threatened her vision of society. Much like how the Road Warrior was much more campy and brutally bleak, Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome was a comparatively lighter movie than its predecessors. It is also the only Mad Max film where the villain was not killed off. Although Aunty Entity was the undisputed ruler of Bartertown, she also seemed to be the only antagonist in the series who portrayed a sense of sympathy. Unlike Toe Cutter, Dementus, Immortan Joe, and Lord Humongous, who were all brutally violent, power-crazed gang leaders, Aunty Entity did want to replace the despair of the Wasteland with an idea of a world that existed before the fall. Not just that, Aunty Entity is also the only villain in the series who was given a chance to explain her vision for an ideal society. While her methods were unarguably violent and exclusionary, Beyond Thunderdome does not quite portray her as an irredeemable monster. Aunty Entity paved the way for the franchise's strong female character. As per the original Mad Max and its sequel, The Road Warrior, the entire focus was primarily on Mel Gibson's titular character, Max Rokotansky, and his struggles against the chaotic inhabitants of the post-apocalyptic world. As a result, there was not really much space for George Miller to develop any essential female characters. Max's wife in the first movie was mainly portrayed as a damsel in distress, and even the other women we saw had more of a secondary role in Road Warrior. So with Beyond Thunderdome, Miller introduced his first truly complex and multifaceted female character through Tina Turner's Aunty Entity. As the leader of the hardscrabble post-apocalyptic settlement of Bartertown, Aunty Entity matched Max in both strength and intelligence, and even went beyond by embracing the challenges of leadership in a world that is desperate for direction, not necessarily for heroes. Perhaps by understanding how Tina Turner's role impacted Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, Miller seemed to have learned a lesson, which is why he revisited a similar trope with Fury Road and Furiosa, by introducing a strong female co-lead for Max. So while the world is busy raging about Charlize Theron and Anya Taylor-Joy's respective roles as Furiosa, we simply cannot forget how it was actually Tina Turner who set the bar for strong female characters in this powerhouse franchise. Why do we think Aunty Entity was indeed defeated after the events of Mad Max 3 Beyond Thunderdome? So according to what we saw in Furiosa, Bartertown no longer exists by the time Furiosa is taken away by Dementus and traded off to Immortan Joe at the Citadel. After a while, when she starts working for Immortan Joe, Furiosa partners up with Praetorian Jack, who then shows her the ropes of the road, while they drive around in the war rig. During their time together, Jack mentions that the Citadel, Gastown, and Bullet Farm were the only places left in the post-apocalyptic Australian outback. Although the movie does not show up as a full map of the world at this point, Jack did mention that he traveled all across the Wasteland and hence was a reliable source on which cities or settlements still existed. Considering that if Jack was indeed right about the Citadel, Gastown, and Bullet Farm being the only surviving places during the events of the prequel film, then it can only mean that Bartertown must have disappeared. Because I do remember how George Miller had mentioned that everything we see in Fury Road and Furiosa is a continuing chapter or episode from the setting of the original trilogy. Plus, Bartertown literally existed in the middle of the Wasteland during the events of Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, so someone like Jack, who seems to have known the world well, should have been familiar with Aunty Entity's semblance of civilization. Although Bartertown was mostly wrecked by Max and others at the end of the third film, Aunty Entity still wanted to rebuild it, suggesting that it should have still been there during Furiosa's story. But Bartertown was not even mentioned or hinted as one of the cities known by Praetorian Jack, and well, that only gives us a bare idea how obsolete Aunty Entity's fate might have been. Sure, she was undoubtedly a powerful ruler in Beyond Thunderdome, but she was also someone who was eager to build her broken city with a better design and possibly make it even stronger than before. However, we don't know for sure if Aunty Entity even succeeded in rebuilding Bartertown after the events of Beyond Thunderdome, because Jack's statement in Furiosa only implied that either Bartertown was never reconstructed or it was indeed destroyed once again. Of course, I cannot give you a solid explanation behind the absence of Bartertown, but given the fact that it is no longer around can only mean that Aunty Entity was definitely defeated. If you've watched the film, you already know that this woman loved ruling on the illusion of civilization that she had created. Even after Bartertown was destroyed, her only aim was to rebuild the city. But I'm guessing that if she had met her demise, the ambitious idea of reforming Bartertown would have ended with her, because I'm 100% sure that if this woman did manage to rebuild her domain, we would definitely see her become a part of the power in the Wasteland alongside Dementus and Immortan Joe. So this leaves us stuck in the limbo of wondering who really defeated Aunty Entity and prevented Bartertown from rising as a crucial hub in the Mad Max universe. Could Bartertown be what we now know as Gastown? Like I've mentioned before, we do not know what happened to Aunty Entity after Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, so Bartertown's fate is also unclear. However, if any of the tidbits we picked up from Furiosa make sense, it only indicates that Bartertown no longer exists and Aunty Entity has most probably lost all power in the Wasteland. Given that Immortan Joe was indeed the king of the Wasteland during the events of Furiosa, it is quite plausible that her downfall can be linked to Immortan Joe's rise to power. Immortan Joe is surely not a part of the original Mad Max trilogy, but from all the backstory we get in the comics, it does make sense that he emerged as a powerful warlord sometime after Aunty Entity came onto the scene. Now, during the events of Furiosa, while Dementus remained a known adversary in the Wasteland, Aunty Entity might have been a more pressing thorn for Immortan Joe. it would have not exactly been very surprising if Immortan Joe saw conquering or destroying Bartertown as a necessary step in his quest for power. However, this is just a speculation as we don't have any concrete information about how Aunty Entity was taken down, and let's just be honest, there is a crazy huge list of other things that could kill you in the Wasteland. Still, I think if Miller ever explored the concept of Immortan Joe taking down Aunty Entity, it would really be a banger arc that would only make the Mad Max lore richer. There's also some interesting evidence suggesting that Immortan Joe might have drawn inspiration from Aunty Entity and her Bartertown when building his empire. The Mad Max Fury Road prequel comic even reveals that Gastown has its own version of Thunderdome, thus implying that the legacy of Bartertown and Aunty Entity lived on through some form. Not just that, it is also possible that the original or rebuilt version of Bartertown later evolved into Gastown after Immortan Joe conquered it. If that is really the case, then through the existence of Gastown, we actually get to see a more refined version of Bartertown being featured in Furiosa, a Mad Max Saga. In what sense did Aunty Entity inspire Immortan Joe to build his citadel? There is absolutely no doubt on the fact that the Citadel is undeniably a brutal and oppressive place, especially for women and the less fortunate. But however regressive it might be, the Citadel does have a defined society and power structure, albeit in the form of a nightmarish hellscape. While Immortan Joe was a self-serving dictator who kept a steady flow of sex slaves as his breeders, exploited women in unimaginable ways, and even starved the masses by keeping them from the basic necessities of food and water, its entire structure somehow feels like a derivative from Aunty Entity's more benevolent and similarly ambitious attempt at recreating a fully functioning society and Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. Now, compared to the chaotic warlords and the Road Warriors' grim background, Tina Turner's Aunty Entity stands out as a more composed and stable main antagonist. I mean, sure, Tina Turner's performance does add a necessary touch of campiness to Aunty Entity, making her a morally ambiguous character who is not entirely good or bad, and is continuously trying to stick out somewhere in between. But through Fury Road, we see the exploration of the same kind of pseudo-society that Aunty Entity built, and simply imagine what kind of impact that level of power could have had in the hands of a less benevolent benefactor. What kind of similarities do we see in Aunty Entity and Furiosa? So much like Furiosa, Aunty Entity was shown to be someone striving to bring law and order to a harsh and unforgiving world. Just like Furiosa, who was praised as a refreshingly strong and resilient action heroine by the critics, Aunty Entity had been toughened by the hopeless brutality of the Wasteland. While she appeared to have good intentions for her people, she also tried to manipulate Max into killing a mentally disabled man for her own gain, basically proving that she was not without her moral flaws. Just like Furiosa, whose harsh past hardened her and turned her into a sharp knife, Aunty Entity had been similarly toughened by a brutal world, making her morally ambiguous at best. But her decision to order Blaster's murder does put her in a complex position, somewhere sticking her between Furiosa's generally good but cynical nature and the callous violence of other Mad Max villains. While Aunty Entity can be seen as a totalitarian like Immortan Joe, her treatment of her citizens is comparatively less cruel and violent. But again, just how Aunty Entity got Blaster killed despite him suffering from Down syndrome, Furiosa also seemed to mirror her lack of sympathy for all the brainwashed war boys she killed in Fury Road. However, there is one crucial difference here. Furiosa was fighting for her life against a crazy cult run by a horrible man aiming to keep women oppressed, while Aunty Entity's motivations were really more self-serving. It is almost impossible to know how Furiosa would have turned out if she was not abducted by Dementus and had to watch her mother get killed, which is exactly why George Miller used Aunty Entity in Beyond Thunderdome to show how even a seemingly rational and understandable villain can emerge in a brutal world. So it is really hard to say if Furiosa would stay fair and just, or if power would get to her head. In the Mad Max world, nobody, not Aunty Entity, Furiosa, or even Max, are without their share of violence. Ultimately, we still do not know how Furiosa would go on to become a slave to her circumstances after her victory over Immortan Joe, and eventually ascend into a position of tyranny. But if Miller were ever to expand on this lore, I will most definitely be among the first to watch it. How about you guys? What do you guys think about this theory? Let us know of your thoughts in the comment box below. If you like the content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.